This slideshow explores the war power. We'll consider two questions. First, how the Constitution allocates the war power between the President and Congress. And secondly, how broad the President's war powers are, and to what extent they vary depending on whether the President is acting in accordance with congressional will. The Constitution allocates the war power, like the foreign affairs power more broadly, to both of the political branches. It's a shared power rather than the exclusive province of either the President or Congress. What's unclear, though, is exactly how it's shared. Let's look at three areas of uncertainty. It's plain from the text of the Constitution that Congress is empowered to declare war. But that doesn't mean it has the exclusive authority to enter an armed conflict. And it's here that some uncertainty has arisen. So we see from Madison's notes on the Federal Convention of 1787 that the framers decided to replace the words make war with the words declare war, because they wanted to be sure that the executive would be left with the power to repel sudden attacks, and they worried that the words make war might suggest that Congress and not the President had that power. In the prize cases, we see a narrow majority of the Supreme Court conclude that even though Congress alone has the power to declare a national or foreign war, the President, as Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces and of the militia, is authorized and indeed obliged to take action and resist an invasion coming from a foreign nation, even if it hasn't first gotten congressional authorization. And indeed, the President is also similarly bound to respond to the insurrection that gave rise to the U.S. Civil War by taking action even without congressional authorization. Accordingly, the court concluded that the blockade imposed by the President was lawful, even though it was imposed prior to a declaration of war by Congress. And in reaching this view, the court rejected the view of the dissenters who had argued that no state of civil war existed until Congress recognized it in legislation several months later. So when we look at these two precedents in tandem, what we see is an intention pretty clear by the end of the Civil War to ensure that the President has the authority to act fast in the capacity that he or she as a unitary actor can to repel an invasion even without Congress getting involved in the conversation. Since that time, moreover, we have seen presidents repeatedly deploy U.S. forces in armed conflict without a formal declaration of war by the U.S. Congress. Sometimes this has been done pursuant to broadly framed congressional resolutions like the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution or the 2002 authorization to use military force, even though these resolutions seem not to serve some of the traditional functions of a declaration of war insofar as they don't fully put on notice either Americans or those abroad about our intentions. And indeed, sometimes we have seen presidents deploy U.S. forces without even a resolution of any kind. Thus, the Obama administration argued that the president's unilateral decision to use force in Libya in 2011 was supported by sufficiently important national interests to fall within the president's constitutional power, according to a memorandum from the Office of Legal Counsel. This was in part because the degree of military engagement, according to the administration, was too limited to trigger Congress's authority to declare war, particularly since no ground forces had been deployed. What was needed, the administration argued, was, quote, prolonged and substantial military engagements, typically involving exposure of U.S. military personnel to significant risk over a substantial period. So you should consider whether you agree with that standard. Is it consistent with the framers' intention? Do we need, according to the Constitution, to have prolonged and substantial military engagements in order to have war? And either way, is it justified by the exigencies presented by contemporary geostrategic threats? Your analysis of this question might also bear on your view regarding whether the provision of the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which requires the president to terminate the use of armed forces within 60 days of reporting it to Congress if Congress has not authorized their use, whether that is constitutional. So a second area of uncertainty comes into play with respect to the conduct of war. We know that as Commander-in-Chief, the President has substantial authority to oversee military operations during a war. But there is some uncertainty about Congress's role at this juncture after a war has commenced. So the President's primary authority seems to be reflected in Madison's notes on the Federal Convention of 1787, where Congress, as I just mentioned, was not given the power to, quote, make war. And that was also in part because, quote, that might be understood to conduct war, to conduct war, which was an executive function. But it's also reflected in the fact that while the Constitution empowers Congress in Article 1 to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, the framers chose not to adopt the formula that had been used in the Articles of Confederation, which gave Congress the broader power of making rules for the government and regulation of the said land and naval forces and of directing their operations. And so the deletion of those words and of directing their operations, according to some scholars, should be meant to lead to the conclusion that Congress should not be directing war operations in the middle of a war. But does this mean that Congress has no role to play in directing the conduct of war? We know that at a minimum, Congress maintains the power of the purse strings. It is empowered to raise and support armies, though no appropriation of money for that use is to be for a term longer than 2 years. And it's also empowered to provide and maintain a navy. So through the withholding of funds, Congress can regulate the exercise of the war power even after hostilities have started. But does this mean that Congress can tell the president how to run a war or when to end it? The scale of Congress's powers are really a point of contention in the scholarly literature. According to one view, which is often associated with Professor John Yoo at Berkeley, who also served in the second Bush administration, congressional efforts to control the military against the president's wishes are an infringement of the Commander-in-Chief clause because they deprive the president of the full ability to give commands. On the other hand, Professor Sai Krishna Prakash argues that Congress has complete power over the military. Only where Congress's direction has not been specific, he argues, does the president have substantive command authority. A third area of uncertainty is just how broad the president's war powers are. Do those war powers, for example, constitutionally include the right to free enslaved persons? If so, did that right extend only to those who were in states engaged in an insurrection against the United States? Or did it go beyond that to include anyone enslaved anywhere in the United States? Some scholars have argued in favor of the latter interpretation that you can make an argument that freeing enslaved persons all across the country, including in border states that had not allied themselves with the Confederacy, would make a contribution to the war effort, and that therefore President Lincoln was constitutionally empowered to do that, pursuant to the Commander-in-Chief Clause. But if the president had the right to free enslaved persons in order to advance the war effort, could the president constitutionally order the enslavement or execution of enemy prisoners in retaliation for the Confederates enslaving or executing Union soldiers? And if you believe that this was possible, could a president constitutionally order the internment of Japanese Americans living on the west coast of the United States if that was considered militarily necessary? Now, if your answer to either of these last two questions is no, if you think a president's war powers do not extend to ordering the execution of prisoners of war, or do not extend to interning Japanese Americans, is it because you think it is outside the reach of the president's express or inherent or / implied powers under the Constitution, that the Commander-in-Chief Clause, for example, just doesn't go that far? Or is it, in your view, because it represents a violation of the constitutional rights of enemy prisoners, of the constitutional rights of Japanese Americans? Here is where we come back to this idea that our analysis is a two-step analysis, first considering whether an institution is empowered to do something, and then secondly considering whether, even if it might be empowered to do something, some constitutional rights serve as a shield preventing that power from being exercised. As you think about these questions, bear in mind that, as in other spheres, the president's powers are broader when the president is acting pursuant to congressional authorization than when the president is acting alone. In other words, when the president is in the green zone of Jackson's tripartite framework in Youngstown, the president is on stronger ground than when the president is in the yellow or the red zone. So even if a particular congressional act, like for instance, the authorization to use military force that Congress provided in 2002 prior to the Iraq War, even if that was not a declaration of war, as was imagined in the Constitution, it nevertheless strengthened the case that the president's use of military force was constitutionally grounded. In this respect, it is also significant, if very lamentable, that Congress and the president were acting in tandem when internment camps were created for Japanese during World War II, as was discussed in the Korematsu case. So once again, that tripartite framework set out in Youngstown is also relevant for us in the context of the exercise of the war power for determining when it has been constitutional, whether the president's involvement is at stake or Congress's involvement is at stake.